Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Anna Rohlater, and I'm the head of communications here at Sourcefabric. This is the second webinar in our special series marking our 10-year anniversary as an organization dedicated to making open-sourced software for journalism. But instead of reviewing the past, we really wanted to look ahead and see what the future holds for the news media, especially now, when the coronavirus pandemic has raised the stakes for the survival of journalism even more. Which brings us to the subject of today's webinar, the post-COVID newsroom, big ideas for better journalism. Our moderator today is my colleague, Greg Bruno. Greg has spent more than 2 decades in and around journalism as a reporter, editor, author, and communications professional. As a writer here at Sourcefabric, he believes that a strong media industry starts with solid technology. When Greg's not crafting blog posts or tweaking the next newsletter, he's either enjoying nature or working on his own writing. So before I turn it over to Greg, just a couple of brief notes about our session. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function in Zoom and address all panelists and attendees. Also, we will be making a recording of this for anyone who can't attend or would like to watch later. And so with that, please take it away, Greg.
Right, thanks, Anna, for,
Looks like you're muted, Greg.
Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Yes, I've been watching enough webinars these days that I should know how to do that. Well, thanks, Anna, for that introduction. It's wonderful to see so many people on the call, the webinar today, including many friends that we've worked with over the years here at Sourcefabric. As we no doubt recognize at this moment, COVID-19 is a trigger event that is deeply affecting our industry of journalism. 6 months into this crisis, we're living through a journalistic extinction event like no other in modern memory. No news organization is immune from this threat, regardless of size, as we learned last week when The Guardian announced plans to cut 180 jobs, including 70 coming from editorial. Now, the good news is that this period of journalistic disruption is accelerating innovations and providing fresh thinking from those within the news industry. We've long been told that journalism needs a new business model. What might that business model look like? Well, the panel that we have today has some answers. Some of the best minds in journalism to help us ponder the big ideas that can shape the journalism of the future. Now, let me briefly introduce the panelists who are with us today. And let me switch my screen and start this presentation. There it is. All right, let's start at the beginning. So our first panelist I'll introduce is Emily Goligoski. She is the Senior Director of Audience Research for The Atlantic, where she works to understand readers' needs and to help the magazine grow. Before joining The Atlantic, she was the Research Director at the Membership Puzzle Project at New York University. And before that, she led user experience research at the New York Times. John Crowley is the digital editor and journalist with 20 years of experience in the industry, managing teams and budgets across a variety of titles. He was the digital editor for the Wall Street Journal in Europe, the Middle East and Africa, and also previously worked for the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the International Business Times in the UK. Kunda Dixit is the founder, editor, and publisher of Nepali Times, where he joins us from today. Nepali Times is an English language newspaper based in Kathmandu, Nepal. He's also the author of several books, including one on environmental journalism, and he's one of the leading experts on the media industry in Southeast Asia. Patricia Torres-Burd is the managing director for media advisory services at the Media Development Investment Fund. She's based here in Prague, where I am. She and her team provide technical assistance to more than 100 newsrooms in 42 countries. She also serves on the advisory boards of Sembra Media and the Jack J. Valenti School of Communications. And finally, Trewinnard is the co-founder and COO of Fathom, a a digital media consultancy. Formerly Director of Programs at Medan, Tom led Check Global, an initiative dedicated to developing innovative open source tools for journalists and researchers. Thank you very much for being here, all of you. So let's dive right in. We're here to talk about solutions, but I think in order to do that, we need to first set the stage. So before we talk about the big ideas, I'd like to ask Patricia if she could help us frame the challenges that we're trying to kind of ideate here. How has this moment of COVID-19 affected the journalism industry as a whole? And are we seeing challenges and problems on a broad geographic distribution? I mentioned in my intro that no news organization is immune. Ground truth that for us. What are we seeing?
So I think globally we can say that there's probably not a single media organization that hasn't been affected by this in terms of loss of revenue. We're seeing anything in the portfolio clients and the partners that we work with, conservatively 30 to 60%, and in some cases as much as 75% loss in revenue. And that is, putting not only undue pressure on companies as far as their sustainability, but how do they keep providing the news that is so critical at this time, and in many cases will save lives. So I think globally you can say that, blanket revenue has dried up. Many had diversified revenue sources such as events. Look at us, we're on a Zoom call. We can't meet up personally anymore. So I think in that respect, in terms of the things that media organizations are having to do globally, I think that does vary. It varies greatly depending on the part of the world that they're in. Depends greatly on the type of government that they work under, how affected the different areas have been affected by COVID. We know that there's some countries that have done very well and others are now seeing the worst of it. In addition to that, I think that you add into it the economics of each one of the regions and the ability of people to be able to support a media organization, even if they want to, then it becomes very, very complicated. I will say that one of the things we have seen, and this is probably an obvious, but if somebody was already struggling or having issues, this crisis has just magnified it. And so what we have seen is those that were already ahead of the curve, those that last year somehow or other had already implemented new ways of innovating, new ways of reaching audiences like Emily will talk about, new ways of engaging reader revenue, new ways of doing that. They are doing much better today, even though that they're still affected because it wasn't a matter of starting from scratch in probably one of the worst situations ever.
Yeah, I mean, those are significant numbers that you're talking about. I mean, huge losses in revenue. And, contradictorily, we're seeing these falls in revenue at the same time that readership is going through the roof for a lot of news organizations. That just underscores the importance and the value of the information that journalism, local journalism in particular, is providing.
But as we know, most advertisers don't want to have their name associated with a pandemic. Right. So even though if you talk about programmatic, for example, which many audiences many media organizations count on, the CPMs are just, have gone down to non-existent. And so I think advertisers are going to have to find a different way also, which I think, as we start, I don't want to be negative Nancy, but as we start, I think this is going to create innovative ways of approaching advertising, of approaching your audience, and we're already seeing great innovation. So I'm dying to learn from the fellow panelists.
Yeah, I mean, let's stick with you. As we turn into this kind of conversation of solutioning, we don't want to be too negative, right? So we could easily spend 3 hours being negative. Let's spend an hour on solutions. So what are some of the things that you're seeing that MDIF members and clients are doing to innovate? You touched on new ways of hosting events. You touched on advertising. What are some specifics? And then we'll go around the panel and ask the same
question. So I think first and foremost, the ones that are able to listen to their audience and able to see what else the audience needs apart from that COVID news and retain them, those are the ones that are finding new opportunities. They may be finding that they now have a cultural or a book section or a finance section, economy section that maybe before wasn't so important. And they've been able to, attract audiences to maintain there. And I think we hope that the ones that are doing it right will be able to maintain this audience and keep these numbers far beyond COVID. Emily's going to talk about this, but we also are seeing some of our smaller regional clients who have done the virtual funeral, you know, ways of people honoring those people that they've lost has been a real way of showing respect for what people are going through and also engaging. There's media organizations that have been very strategic, and I think strategy and being strategic, forward thinking is going to be the key, or has been the key for success in saying what we do today and how we react today and how we work with advertisers and or small business enterprises is going to bring us returns in relationship, credibility, trust, and hopefully business once this thing is over, whatever that new normal looks like. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's, you know, you and I are neighbors, we're in Prague, and it's amazing that every day, you know, you see what a client is doing and you think, wow, they're being so innovative. You know, there's a small group out of our South African Media Innovation Program that realize that there's people in far remote villages that don't have access to the internet. And so they did news via what they're calling radio via WhatsApp, because most phone services provide free WhatsApp in South Africa. And so people are having access to information that can save lives.
Great. Well, that's fascinating, the creativity. Let's go to Kunda. Kunda, your newspaper is living this as we speak. So we're talking about news organizations, you know, and kind of the broad overview. Take us down to your newsroom. How are you managing?
Well, I'm trying to stay positive, but you know, there's a lot of doom and gloom. As luck would have it, we are marking our 20th anniversary this week of our newspaper. But back in 2000, when we started, we were actually an online publication first. So we already had quite a strong digital footprint. But then when this crisis hit, very early on in March itself, we had stopped our hard copy printing. We had to very reluctantly close down our printing facility, which was a family business. We sold off all our machines. And these were perhaps steps that we were planning to take anyway in the next 3-4 years, you know, in the digital transition. But the pandemic just brought the date forward. But it was so sudden that we were not yet fully prepared to pivot to a digital-only product so soon. And so 80% of our advertising was still in print. And many of them are very reluctant to shift to online so far. And I think it'll take us time to adjust to this new reality. But you know, since I'm both publisher as well as editor, I'm forced to look at this crisis both from a management as well as a editorial perspective. And there is really no other option but to ride it out and to make our savings last. We have started exploring various ideas, collaborations, but it's the time to really strengthen our content and build our brand, as Patricia was saying, through new kinds of content, new exclusive original content. And as you said also, Bruce, that, you know, the readership has hit the roof, but and Patricia was saying that MDIF clients have between 30 to 60% drop in advertising. Well, we've had 100% drop in advertising. So revenue is zero. And in fact, in the 6 months since the crisis, things are actually looking bleaker. So we just have to cut our losses, and we have cut costs to the bone, and just try to survive the next few months at least.
I mean, I want to talk about this more a little bit later, but while we're with you, you mentioned collaboration. Is this opening up new opportunities for collaborations with other newsrooms, for instance?
Newsrooms, not so much, but communication organizations, definitely. And I think it's born out of necessity. You know, it'd be very expensive to invest now in a new video content, you know, in-house, or data journalism or podcasting. So we're exploring possibilities of collaborating with the institutions which already do this. They need a platform to get wider readership, whereas we would need content to go into our system. So it'd be a win-win. but everyone is hurting. So it's you know, it's very difficult to actually convince everyone that we are on the same boat and we have to ride this out together.
Right, right. Well, thanks. You know, obviously we're here to support, and hopefully, you know, the ideas that circulate, you know, will have a positive effect. But you know, I'm a recently, you know, kind of online reader of what you're doing, and there's some great content. So the branding is certainly important. Let's go to Tom, because you know, Tom has been working with a lot of news organizations that are adjusting kind of as you know, in real time. And you know, one of the hallmarks of this moment, especially during the early lockdown periods, was you know, the work from home challenge. And for news organizations in particular, which you know, images are conjured up of newsrooms that are bustling and lots of people and editorial planning. You're of the mind that perhaps this is a moment to kind of question that model, or at least giving news organizations tools so that isn't the only model. You've recently published, with the support of the Google News Initiative, the Distributed Newsroom Playbook, helping news organizations kind of be distributed. You don't like to call it remote, but distributed. So walk us through what that looks like for the future of news organizations.
Sure. Yeah, and as some background, a lot of my work over the past 5 years has been at the intersection of kind of editorial collaboration, which sort of de facto requires you to set up distributed workflows, right? So when Fergus Bell and I, at this kind of start of lockdown, were thinking about what insights did we have that could be valuable to newsrooms, we are very familiar with working on editorial initiatives, sometimes big editorial initiatives, without that kind of central newsroom space. And so we really wanted to try and distill, with the help of experts like John and Federica Cherubini and others, distill some of the lessons that we'd learned and some pitfalls to avoid. And we wanted to do that in a way that was not simply how can you survive lockdown, but with a view to how can you capitalize on this moment to restructure your organization in a way that can have longer term benefits, of which I think that there are many for distributed working. And so yeah, we have a playbook that's it's open access, and we are also taking kind of survey requests and working with newsrooms all over the place to try and provide targeted advice on how do you know, beyond kind of survival mode, how do you move into kind of operationalizing distributed working, particularly when that might mean a hybrid operation where you have a physical in-person newsroom, but you also need a kind of parallel structure. And looking forward, how do you how can you innovate effectively in a distributed setting, and how do you you know, I think one of the things that a lot of people feel is lost is a sense of serendipity and moments of creativity, which, you know, are a very organic thing to happen in newsrooms, and I think newsrooms are creative spaces. How do you when you translate to a distributed newsroom, you have to be a bit more intentional with how you set up those interactions and those moments, and how you facilitate them. So it's been extremely interesting, and the response to the playbook has been great. I think one thing that we in getting survey responses, a lot of the respondents, they have focused on the kind of operational challenges of working from home and communications, and, you know, quite functional things. But a lot of the responses have also touched on the business challenges around lost advertising, which you know, it's hit everywhere as far as we're hearing. And so I think that there's an interesting kind of intersection of, is there a way of sort of taking the opportunity of the distributed newsroom and building sustainability around that. So yeah, there's I'm really happy to be part of this discussion, and I think it's yeah, very rich insights already.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you, when your distributed Newsroom playbook came out, you published a piece in Nieman Lab, kind of talking about a lot of the things that you just mentioned, the fact that physical newsrooms are physical assets that require a lot of money to maintain and run. One place where news organizations can save money is by being distributed and not having that physical space. So that's one thing that I find interesting because it's very practical. But I was speaking to somebody the other day, a media expert from the global South, and he said that newsrooms are about power in a lot of places. And we can all think about, our time in newsrooms, where somebody important would walk through, go to the editor's office, and we're all sitting around our desks and, making, decisions. And that's intimidating, and for news organizations that are owned or operated by either political interests or have some government support, that power element is completely gone in the distributed model. I wonder if you could just talk about, that a little bit, and whether or not this is a one size fits all, or in fact, there's elements of it that could work.
Yeah, I don't think I'm necessarily suggesting the kind of doing away with the physical newsroom, although I do think it's important that we have in place structures that can, if there's a second lockdown in October, we need the same structures that we just built to still be existing. And I think beyond, it doesn't make sense to me why you would kind of do away with the work that you've put in. But I think, fundamentally in that Nieman Lab piece, and when I've been a Guardian supporter for as long as I can remember, a digital subscriber, member, everything. And it's so painful to see the cuts there. And from my perspective as a reader and a member, I would rather that those people were still in place, and that maybe the office or the physical presence of the Guardian, which is amazing. It's they have a gleaming office outside King's Cross. It's beautiful, and it speaks to that kind of power dynamic. But would I rather they had maybe a less, a smaller office in Manchester where they could save, how much money would be saved in that kind of thing? And fundamentally, the physical costs of the newsroom, they don't contribute revenue, I think, which is the crux of this. I was listening to one of the WANIFRA eSummit webinars. There was, I can't remember what his role was, but he's very senior at Le Figaro, and he was kind of speaking to this this power issue and the need. He said that Le Figaro had transitioned quite well to a distributed model, but it was unthinkable really for him, for Le Figaro, not to have an office, a physical presence in the heart of Paris. But what he did say, which I thought was really interesting, and he didn't have an answer for this, but he said that he wasn't sure, he was now no longer sure that the best use of that space was to have 150 people sitting behind computers. And so I think that's a kind of moment, an opportunity for creativity. And so maybe there is a way to turn those physical presences, which do have benefits, benefits for work for sure, benefits for that sense of power. Is there a way of making that a kind of revenue positive contribution as well? And I think that the sort of acceleration of trends that existed pre-COVID at the moment is kind of pushing to the fore new thinking around those kind of questions, which is what I'm really excited about.
Great, well, thank you. I want to bring Emily in to the conversation. We're kind of covering all of the myriad challenges, from business challenges, physical, operational challenges. Emily, you spend a lot of time considering the concerns and questions of your audience. Dealing with audience research, understanding the changing habits and desires and needs of the audience, of the Atlantic's audience at this time. I imagine there's a fair degree of COVID-19 fatigue that has set in. I'm curious, this is, it's been quite a while, 6 months to many of us feels like 10 years. Has anything new emerged from your research, from the news organization's experience in terms of new content types that are being offered in response to this moment?
Sure, it's an excellent question, and I will get to your fatigue and new product question. I want to back up just a little bit and take us back to early February. We had a writer, Dr. James Hamlin, who published a piece, "You're Likely to Get the Coronavirus." And in audience interviews and in conversations with our readers, we heard that pieces like this really served a need that they had at this time for give me clarity and context that doesn't, it feels straightforward. It feels like it's talking to me without drama. And a big part of that is the altitude that we and other organizations aim to publish at, which is one that is approachable, that even if you're coming into the topic, you have no background in epidemiology, as is the case for most of us, you can still make sense of a complex and thorny topic. There is some great advice from the Engaged Journalism Collaborative called Gather. And one of the things that they say is, keep asking your community for their questions and check in with them about their information needs. With that in mind, there's a couple of different things that we did starting earlier this year. The first is the recognition that this is not just a science story. Of course, this is a topic that affects culture, family, economics, employment, of course, politics. And that has ramifications for us well down the line when we think about non-COVID coverage and even potentially breaking the barrier on some of like what we had historically thought of as section-specific coverage. The second thing we did is took down the paywall for much of our COVID coverage. And this was, we felt that there's a public service mandate around doing so. The third thing that we did, and this is really a low fidelity approach, is that across our research team and our editorial organization, we created a shared spreadsheet of all of the questions that we were hearing across Instagram, across calls to our customer care representatives. We hosted a survey for readers with where we got about 1,400 responses from around the world. And if you came to our help center on theatlantic.com, you would see basically a call like, help us keep you informed about COVID-19. What we started doing as a sort of cross-disciplinary team is cataloging questions as they came in from readers. Everything from, can I fly on an airplane? Is it safe to get a tattoo? In addition to masks, should I wear gloves? And if so, what kind? And then having our reporters answer them in our most read newsletter, our daily newsletter. I should mention, by the way, we're not alone in this approach. The Washington Post similarly has an FAQ on its site for easy access to commonly asked COVID questions. It was really fascinating, and just a few things that I wanted to share from the data. When we coded open-ended responses, so what are the considerations from early in the pandemic that our readers had? The first most common was medical coverage and transmission questions. Here we heard things like, quote, I find it difficult to decipher the conflicting and changing guidelines from different medical experts. I don't know that that has changed necessarily. Second, we heard country level questions and political questions. So in my country, I'm unclear of who to trust. Third, and fascinatingly, questions from would-be subscribers about alternate payment methods. So this is not just, I live abroad and I want to be able to use my debit card. This is, I have lost my employment and I want to be able to pay you for your work. Is there some other sort of arrangement that we could get into, a monthly arrangement, or I really congratulate the Financial Times for making their work freely available to not only students, but NHS workers in the UK. And then we also heard, as you would expect, significant questions about social distancing, regional requests and service coverage, economic ramifications, and lastly, questions about the history of pandemics globally. All of this has us thinking a lot about, well, what are the implications for the Atlantic's potential foray into service coverage? So thinking about, are there ramifications here that can be really positive, actually, as we think about telling the story of climate change around the world, which I would liken to a similarly terrifying experience where people sort of throw up their hands and don't know what to do. In thinking about COVID coverage fatigue, which is absolutely real, early in the year, we saw that, especially for readers under 35, 3/4 said that COVID-19 coverage was their main reason for visiting the Atlantic on desktop or on mobile. Then in April, readers' motivations started to shift, exactly as you would expect, with most people saying, this is one of several topics I'm following, not the only one. And that has sort of continued. In regards to sort of open-ended questions about specific types of coverage that readers are seeking from the Atlantic, we heard above and beyond, and keep in mind that most of our readership is domestic in the United States, understanding how the US and other governments are responding to the crisis. Second, information about how the virus is spreading and its potential impacts. And then thirdly, analyses of how people are living through self-quarantining and social distancing. The last thing that I quickly will say, because I'm going on and on here, is, when we are thinking about audience listening and audience engagement, my goal is for us to become an audience-informed news organization. Everyone has opinions, and opinions will not run our newsroom. We still run with absolutely a strong editorial sensibility that does guide what we cover. But at this time, I think, as my 4-year-old would tell you, turning on your listening ears is a really powerful act, and one that's incredibly important for the financial sustainability of our organizations as well.
You touched on it, but I'll kind of pull a little bit more if we could. In the example that you gave at the beginning, you're one of these really well-read stories, and I think the headline was "You're likely to get COVID." I mean, that's a headline. It's very attention-grabbing for sure. And I'm sure it was well read for the urgency that inspired. But I wonder if there's a risk versus what is the risk versus reward of news organizations that tailor content, towards the kind of the needs and the instincts of an audience that generally has, short attention spans, we refer to clickbait. There's the piece of, the traditional old school journalist in all of us probably, who cringes at that idea. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you, from an editorial perspective, use your insights to help move the newsroom in a way that doesn't erode editorial independence.
Sure, and the point is well taken around, coverage that can feel like it's really sensational. I'll give you an example to pick on my former employer of the New York Times had a story in the past week about the births of premature babies being down during coronavirus, and had a line, researchers think that this could possibly be because mothers are not commuting, they're not stressed about work, and they're spending more time relaxing and getting support from family. On the face of it, I thought that is not the experience of any person I know. That is lazy reporting, because I simply am yet to see that bear out. The story, and this is very devastating, but the story did not also talk about the incidence of stillborn births, which is a really important thing when we talk about premature birth. How has that rate changed? And what I would say a risk, to get to your question, is in our desire to kind of feed the beast at this time, and to remark on something that on the face of it seems really positive. Maybe there are more babies being born to term. We are potentially checking some of our research rigor and fact checking rigor at the door as an industry. I understand why this is happening. I think we're all exhausted, as we'll be talking about further in this call. Like the risks of staff resiliency at this time are real. And I think one thing that, and again, to come back from the great recommendations from Gather, you know, one of the things that they say is like, keep your audience in the loop about the challenges of reporting at this time. I think this is, if there's ever been a moment to show our humanity, like letting them know that we're citing the best information that we have. We'll work quickly to give them updates if anything changes. It's a real opportunity to speak up for our journalism, to talk about our processes, our goals, our ethics, and frankly, how our staffs are doing at a moment of unprecedented layoffs, I think is really important.
Great, well, thank you. John has been waiting incredibly patiently, so we're going to drag John into the conversation now. And it's a very good segue, as if we almost wrote it. John, you've spent a lot of time in these last few months surveying journalists themselves, asking them how this crisis is affecting their industry and how they would like to see their industry adapt. I wonder if you could give us a sense. I mean, you wrote in a piece kind of highlighting and previewing your findings. You said that this moment is essentially a do or die one for news organizations. Explain that a little bit, but also if you could just touch on some of the challenges journalists themselves are going through, the mental health challenges, the exhaustion, and whether or not news organizations have support for those types of challenges within the newsroom.
So thank you for having me on here, and just listening to everyone has been amazing. I'll try to keep this fairly brief. I think first of all, the reason why I did this survey was because I was burnt out myself. And I think that people sort of don't have to kind of admit it, but I think it was something that I had to do. So 2 years ago, I did a similar survey into workplace burnout, because I certainly felt, and I could see it with my colleagues, that we were being overwhelmed by a tsunami of emails, push notifications, different platforms to keep on board. And then when COVID and lockdown came, I thought this might be another opportunity to kind of ask people on the shop floor, journalists on the shop floor, how they felt. And I think that there's a lot of newsroom leaders who kind of talk about doing things and pivot and change direction. But I feel that there isn't many journalistic surveys out there that kind of really get the opinions of people who are in the trenches, so to speak. So in terms of the stress, obviously it's kind of there. And so in terms of my survey findings, I think it was something like 94% of journalists felt that the newsroom would not return to normal. 87% that they felt the workplace, the newsrooms or their newsroom leaders had a responsibility to check into their well-being, which is a kind of an interesting thing. How much does your work reach into your kind of personal life, but to check in how you're doing. 50% felt their productivity in terms of working from home had been impacted. 58% were either worried or depressed with regards to their new work situation. And 36% said it had impacted on their relationships, either with family members or people they were living with. So it's kind of a live subject out there. As Kunda said at the top, 100% revenue has been lost. And I think journalist wellbeing isn't seen as, obviously, as a revenue driver. You can't trace that back. But if you don't have a functioning workforce, if the whole workforce is burnt out or is approaching going in that direction, then they're not able to do their jobs. So it's hard to kind of trace that back and kind of push that up the chart of things that needs to be done. And by God, there's a lot of things that needs to be done. But I think, workplace well-being needs to be in that conversation, and it shouldn't kind of demand too much time and resource from newsroom. Or it just needs a bit of 360-degree awareness and just kind of knowing out there that people are suffering. They're writing about unremittingly depressing news. They're scared about their jobs. People being made redundant. They're being forced to kind of work from home in either on their own which is kind of difficult, not having any physical interaction with people, or with everyone on top of them, like young families, kids. You know, we've seen kids kind of walking into kind of Zooms, and that's the funny aspect of it. But then we all go away and we have to kind of manage our work and our lives. So in that sense, it's a big deal. In terms of kind of the wider notion about going forward, that the feedback that I got was that they wanted, again, this is people on the shop floor, they wanted kind of a direction, they wanted a vision. And they feel, I think a lot of news organizations, newsroom leaders don't give them a vision at all. Where are we going? In the same way, if you look at kind of BP has kind of got a 20-year vision, yeah, about how it's going to become carbon neutral. If I said to a newsroom leader, what's your 20-year vision? I'd kind of be laughed kind of out it and just saying, well, we're struggling so much right now, we don't have time to kind of look into the future. But I would argue that perhaps not 20 years, but certainly we need to look 1 year, 5 years, maybe even 10 years into the future about where your newsroom organization is and what's it doing, and then communicate it to the staff. Because that's the feeling from the shop floor that I'm getting, a lot of anger. We don't know what's going on. We don't feel that we're being catered for. The other thing, flexible working, and I could go on, but I'll probably best if I stop there.
Well, continue. I am curious on the solutioning. So, you've identified a lot of challenges, and those of us who have been journalists, worked in newsrooms, griping is kind of part of the trade. But these times feel different, right? The well-being of staff at a moment where resources are stretched thin and content needs are higher than ever. The demands placed on journalists today are through the roof. So I'm just curious as to, what types of solutions the news organizations that you communicate with are doing, working from home, flexible hours. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, well, first of all, we need to have a conversation about the ad model, which has kind of sustained the news industry for the last 300 years. Is it irretrievably broken? Perhaps we don't have enough time for that in this talk to go into it, but it's in a bad state at the moment. And the difference, I think one of your questions you were going to say is the internet more of a threat, or COVID more of a threat? I think COVID could hasten the demise of a lot of news organizations, but the difference with COVID is that the whole world is in a recession. There's so many industries in a recession, including the ad industry. So if people think the ad industry is going to charge a white knight in shining armor is going to come and rescue news organizations and kind of spend money again, that they're mistaken. The difference with the internet was it didn't cause a recession, and it's a huge opportunity. I think everyone on this call will agree that the digital storytelling, the way of reaching new people, has been completely transformed. But it's our business model that is broken, and everyone is kind of thrashing around for a solution. I mean, and I think we have to accept that, that notion that, Google and Facebook would, send all our content to the masses and the money would pour in. Obviously that hasn't worked. We have to think about, membership, subscription models, how that can kind of fund us. We have to look at bigger questions as well about, news organization status. So there were, in the UK where I'm based, there was something called the Cairncross Review, which was done by Dane Cairncross, which was to look into government funding for news organizations, which is just a big deal, because as soon as governments start funding you, if it's not at arm's length, how can you hold these people to account? And you've got to accept that nominally the UK is still a liberal democracy, although some people might disagree with that. But there's obviously parts of the world where you wouldn't get funding from governments, or it's autocratic. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. But I think looking into journalist news organization status, potentially as charitable status, local news organizations I'm talking about. I'm not, if you said the Daily Mail or the Guardian should receive charitable status, there'd be a huge row there. But thinking in terms of building out sustainable models, building out sustainable business models, but then thinking of other forms of funding through philanthropy, platforms, through charitable institutions. And that involves, what Emily was getting at, kind of getting people to rethink what journalism is. And the problem is, at the moment, we're being demonized. The fake news, leader of the free world is attacking us. So we're being assailed from all angles. But I think we need to have big conversations around that.
Great. Well, let's stick with the theme, you know, big ideas, big conversations, kind of do a round robin for the next 10 minutes or so. You know, we promised that this was going to be a conversation about big ideas. And obviously solving all of the challenges that we've laid out requires lots of little ideas probably, and maybe some really big ones. But let's go back to Patricia, if we could. You know, MDIF has done a lot of work in the last couple of months with recommendations for clients in terms of how to weather this period. Talk about the suggestions that you've put forth, that MDIF has put forth, that are really working. The document that I'm referring to is a couple months old now. What's working?
So, you know, the management team at MDIF got together immediately as this thing was beginning to be a reality. And I think it's important to highlight that MDIF was created in a crisis mode. And so it's actually an organization that deals with clients that are always in crisis because they work in difficult political environments or difficult economic areas. And so the decision was made to make a set of recommendations to be put out immediately, because oftentimes crisis happens, and as John pointed out, you know, information to your staff or how you're going to work and what you're going to do tends to sort of be the priority rather than, you know, hoarding cash, which was one of our recommendations. You know, thinking about if you do have to lay people off, thinking about it immediately. How will you repurpose your staff? Of course, number one was always the health of the staff and management, but how will you work remotely? What will you do in order to continue the work? Making sure that everybody was highly, highly prepared for this onslaught of news consumption that we did see coming, because people were going to be desperate for more information, as every single one of us was, and as Emily pointed out. We've been very fortunate that the recommendations were shared far and wide between, and we did something else, which I thought was really critical, is that one thing is for us to put the recommendations out based on the many years and lessons learned of what we had, but then we had held a crisis management call where we had all of our media executives join a call, and it was just sort of, you know, an intimate call that wasn't going to be made public, for everybody to share what they were doing and how they were dealing with the crisis, and also a way for them to, you know, let go of a little bit of, this is my God, what's happening to me, as anybody sharing that. And from that, we even had more recommendations. You know, and one of them was, we've added to our recommendation list, which I think is important, and that was, you know, it's August, but, you know, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. You can't just run, work 24 hours a day. That news adrenaline that all of us news junkies have had and lived through will kill you after a certain amount of time. So in order to continue working, there's a news organization that we work with in Kosovo who had this brilliant idea to schedule their staff to work 3 days on, 2 days off. And then they had one day where they had to answer audience questions that they might not be able to fix, you know, but they could guide people to the right source of organization. So what did that do? It gave them a respite from that incredible push to constantly be informing, but also allowed them the time to stop and think and rest. And then that one day of audience answering and engagement, we thought that was brilliant. We could have never come up with that on our own. So first and foremost, I think what this crisis will have done in terms of businesses, to John's point, is that it will have put a focus on business. Journalism and content creation and delivering it to those audiences is a business, no matter how you look at it, and therefore business truths apply to it. I'm stealing a quote from one of our colleagues, in that you have to be able to approach that, and the healthier you are now, the healthier you are, the better you will be able to survive situations such as this. So I would hope in the future, whether it's our recommendations or the recommendations of everybody that we've seen, great ideas that are coming forth, is that people will begin to understand that you can't live day to day without trying to find a grant on how you're going to pay the rent. You've got to run your organization as a business. You've got to find a way to be sustainable, because this will not be our last crisis. And if this isn't a lesson, I don't know what will be. And I do want to add something else that I mentioned on another webinar. I think this crisis is also going to force newsrooms to really dig a deep look at themselves and make sure that they are diverse. because in crises such as these, the community that is coming to you for information is quite diverse. Their needs are very varied. And unless you understand those, then your ability to inform them will not be possible and you won't be successful.
That's fantastic. Let's pick that thread up on diversity and bring it back to Tom. Because one of the things that he talks about, Tom, in your Neiman Lab piece and things I've heard you talk about elsewhere, is the ability for the distributed model to actually increase diversity of thought and potentially even diversify the types of journalists that you might be able to recruit and work with.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating because as an open source software company, I like technical solutions to kind of real practical challenges. And in this case, a social and political challenge in some ways. Could you talk just a little bit about that diversity thread?
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with Patricia in that there's a kind of mission need for newsrooms to be more diverse. I think the case I made in the Neiman Lab piece is that if you kind of think beyond the physical newsroom, which, so I'm from the UK, if you want to work for a national newsroom in the UK, you've got to move to London, which is by far the most expensive place to live in the UK. And it means that you, the pool of people who can afford to do that is very small, is tiny. And this is also true in the US, right, where people have to move to New York or maybe LA, maybe DC. You know, these are the most expensive places to live. And we know that the proportion of people who will be able to do that from minority ethnic backgrounds is much smaller than it is for in the UK white people. And so there's kind of this economic limiting factor that is inherent with the physical newsroom and physical newsrooms locations in capital cities, where if you can move beyond thinking about that physical requirement to be in central London for your work, then you're going to be able to hire people who can be located anywhere, right? And so it sort of removes this very sort of basic barrier to access for employment, which I think there's so many benefits to that. One is that your talent pool is instantly much wider. The second is and this is a kind of business challenge, right? You have to pay people a lot more in London than you would to do the same work anywhere else. And that money it goes straight into the hands of landlords who charge exorbitant rents to live in these places. It's just not a good use of money. And the third benefit, I think the most important benefit, is that you open access to people from more diverse economic backgrounds, diverse ethnic backgrounds, diverse geographic backgrounds. I mean, I think I lived 6 years in the US and 3 years in Arizona, kind of small town Arizona. And the sense that you have when you live in one of those places of does the New York Times really understand what's going on in your town, it's near zero. And so your coverage is weaker if you're really heavily focused in a capital city or a kind of major metropolitan area. And so the distributed newsroom, just as a kind of concept, allows you to draw on input and talent and collaboration in a much broader sense. And I don't know why that wouldn't be an opportunity that newsrooms would grasp with both hands.
Great, thank you. Kunda, I want to loop you back in. We're talking about journalism and news content as a product and news organizations as businesses. You run the business of the Nepali Times. If you could wave your magic wand and kind of take all these suggestions, or even elevate one or a couple of ideas that would really help the Nepali Times in sustainability, what would it be?
Well, I think some great ideas. I think I was furiously taking notes here. One of them is maybe go for a non-media source of revenue. So, you talked about The Guardian having a fancy office in the middle of London. you rent that out and then run your very skeletal operation out of that. I think that's a great idea. The other is the diversity of the newsroom, the fact that you don't really need a physical newsroom. You can farm out editing, for example, desk work elsewhere, maybe even in a completely different time zone, so that helps you. But you asked us to look for big ideas. Maybe this is not the time for big ideas. I think we need small ideas like that. And small outfits need to be even smaller to survive. So they can be nimble and flexible. And that's what we're trying to be in order to get through this crisis is, it's like the 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were wiped out by the meteorite. They were the biggest reptiles. So, the bigger the media, the greater the business it needs to drum up to survive. And the problem these days is that what is good for online business needn't necessarily be good for journalism. And so we need, Patricia said we, have to focus on business. Absolutely right. But I think it's not going to be business as usual.
I think that's absolutely right. Truer words never spoken. In the spirit of sort of bold ideas that are potentially at their time or are potentially ready to be experimented with, one thing I'm really eager to see is supporters of our journalism underwrite access for others. So, many news organizations are fortunate to have at least a percentage of people who could afford to extend their own membership, subscription, or donation to someone else. Is there a role of almost matchmaking? People who would be interested in the coverage but don't have the means to access it, and those who could underwrite their access. It's something that it's just an idea that feels like its time has come when we think about, making connections where there is need and where there are finances.
I love that idea. That's a great one. I want to use that to kind of, we have just a few minutes left and kind of try to wrap up this whole conversation on a big question, maybe a small idea, but a big question, on collaboration. We've talked, to do what Emily is suggesting would require a degree, of maybe moral responsibility or visionary leadership within one organization. We've talked, in various webinars and various conversations about news organizations getting together, solving either, technological challenges or editorial challenges. Before we started this call, I gave a very long example, and I won't get into it. But I am curious as to whether or not this crisis is kind of the existential crisis that journalism needed to collaborate. Historically, news organizations don't work together. It's very, very oriented on individual scoops, on individual profits, individual news, individual audiences. Has anything changed? And I open it up to anybody. We've got, 4 minutes left.
Can I say that I think that maybe collaboration in terms of content will not always be possible, but there are other ways to collaborate. And so what we're doing today is collaborating and sharing ideas and being open and transparent. I think that, oftentimes if you have a great resource, so it might not, I think journalism stories and collaborated stories have a greater impact, and that is a great way to do it, but that's not always possible. So why not find other ways to share information, staff or whatever it is? And I do think this will force people to do so.
It looks like Tom's leaning in.
With the discussion of kind of the challenges on the ad revenue side, one interesting, it's maybe a pseudo collaboration, but I think the Zeus project from the Washington Post, which is kind of an alternative ad tech stack that supports a kind of more ownership of the ad management by the publisher, and is now being used by a bunch of local newsrooms, people like Snopes, Dallas Morning News. I think that and this is kind of relevant to Sourcefabric, right? I think the opportunities to collaborate around pieces of the technology stack that can support our business is one area which is not kind of editorial or content based, but has really clear business benefits where maybe there's not the same element of competition around reporting.
One thing that I would mention, that last year I worked for an organization which is called First Draft, which is a not-for-profit which tackles disinformation. And I worked during the UK general election, and what we, well, actually successfully in the end got news organizations to do was to work together to share content around disinformation. And our argument was to prevent duplication. If you see something, you know, trying to gain journalists or gain people out there, why not share that all together in one place? We worked on a Slack platform. That was all that we used. So our argument was you can keep your scoops about the election to yourself. But when it came to fake news, we don't like using the term fake news, but it came to disinformation, you could come together and say, look, I've seen this piece of content out there, someone claiming this, is it true? And then we actually got news organizations, and it was hard at the start. It was like pushing a boulder up a hill, just to say, well, actually, just relax. You're not going to give away the keys to your kingdom or whatever, but this will save you time. So if you can knock this down and sort this out, then you can concentrate on your scoops. So I think that's a way to look at it. But just to add to Patricia's point, I think, you know, competitiveness in terms of stories is in our DNA. And I think that's our distinctiveness. So I think if we were sharing editorial content, then each organization would lose their distinctiveness. That, you know, that's not a correct argument, but it's felt by lots of people. But I think there's back office functions, commercial, you know, there's lots of different ways you can collaborate and combine.
Maybe we'll go to Emily. We have about a minute left, but just, you know, on that point, I mean, Emily, you brought up an example of the Atlantic doing an FAQ. You know, the Washington Post did an FAQ, the New York Times did an FAQ. Those aren't scoops. You know, why not collaborate on that type of editorial?
I think it's a great point. There's also, I had mentioned earlier, like the importance of our staff showing its humanity at this time. I am not trying to make light of a devastating situation, but there have been some really creative examples. I'm thinking here of Direct 36, the Hungarian Investigative Reporting Center. One of their co-founders, who's a music expert, curated global playlists for times of social distancing. There are ways that I think we can lend credence to our staff's other areas of expertise. I know one area that we regularly hear about is, I want to know what else your staff is reading beyond you know, research for the pieces that they're reporting on. So I think showing that we are full people who have a lot of interests, including and beyond this pandemic, is really important.
Great. Final word, Kunda?
Well, I asked my finance guy, what should I say? And he said 3 words, liquidity, liquidity, liquidity.
Well, it's good to end with 3 words, 3 very, very big words. So
staying liquid.
Yes. Well, hopefully that your finance guy, you make him happy. Well, look, I want to thank everyone for participating, all the attendees. The attendees haven't left, even though we're 5 minutes over. I especially want to thank a really active chat channel, which was wonderful. So thanks for all the extra information and comments and questions. We will be publishing this recording on our social channels. So if you tuned in late, have no fear. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and enjoy your day and stay safe wherever you are.